The wind, a preacher of desolation, sermonized across the cracked lips of the prairie, its voice a dry rasp that scraped grit into Elias's eyes and down the raw collar of his worn shirt. It had been its constant companion for weeks, this wind, chasing him west, or perhaps, he often thought, chasing something out of him. Lashed to his chest, a small, precious bundle whimpered, a sound more piercing than the wind's endless lament. Lily! Her cries were a counterpoint to the hollow ache where his wife, Martha, used to reside, a space now occupied by dust and a grief so profound it felt like another organ inside him, heavy and cold. His horse, a gaunt roan named Dust, stumbled, its head low, mirroring Elias's own bone-deep weariness. The sun, a malevolent eye in the bleached sky, beat down without mercy, baking the parched earth until it shimmered with mirages of water that were crueler than the thirst itself. He'd bartered his last few bullets for a skin of brackish water 2 days back, and it was gone now, like everything else. Hope was a dwindling ember, nearly smothered by the relentless advance of this empty land. Lily's cries intensified, a desperate, thin wail that clawed at what remained of his resolve. Milk. She needed milk. He'd tried a poultice of chewed jerky and water, a desperate measure that had only made her retch. His own hunger was a distant ache, overshadowed by the fierce, protective terror that gripped him whenever Lily weakened. He'd lost Martha to a fever that swept through their camp like a wildfire, swift and merciless, leaving him with this tiny, fragile life and a chasm of guilt for every breath he still took. He'd been running ever since, from the memories, from the accusing silence of the places they'd shared, but mostly, from the man he'd been before her, a man whose hands knew violence better than tenderness. He topped a low rise, the landscape stretching before him in an unbroken vista of browns and greys, until his eyes snagged on a smudge of darker color in the distance. Structures. Maybe a town, or what was left of one. Dust pricked his ears, a faint flicker of interest in his dull eyes. Elias urged him forward, his own heart a tight knot of apprehension and a desperate, prayer-like hope. As they drew closer, the settlement resolved itself into a handful of weathered buildings, most derelict, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the indifferent sky. A ghost of a town, slowly surrendering to the elements. But then, a thread of smoke, thin and pale, curled upwards from a stone chimney on the southern edge, and beside it, a patch of cultivated land, stubbornly green against the surrounding ochre. A homestead. Life. He steered Dust towards it, the crunch of the horse's hooves on the dry soil unnaturally loud in the profound silence. A lone figure emerged from the cabin as he approached, a woman, her silhouette framed by the harsh sunlight. She moved with a purpose that spoke of resilience, shouldering a rifle as casually as she might a hoe. Elias halted Dust a respectful distance away, his throat too dry to speak immediately. He could feel the weight of his unkempt appearance, the days of trail dust, the hunger that hollowed his cheeks. He was a scarecrow of a man, with a dying child. Sarah watched him, her eyes narrowed, the rifle held steady. Her face was etched with the sun and a quiet sorrow, but her jaw was set. She'd seen drifters before, men pushed to the edge by hardship, sometimes dangerous. Elias slowly, carefully, reached inside his shirt and drew out the bundled form of Lily, her face pale, her breathing shallow. He rasped, his voice cracked and unfamiliar even to himself. My daughter. She needs milk. Please. Anything. He held Lily out, an offering, a plea that stripped him of any remaining pride. Sarah's gaze flickered from his face to the infant, and something in her expression shifted, a subtle thawing of the harsh vigilance. The rifle didn't lower, not yet, but the tension in her stance eased almost imperceptibly. She'd buried her own Tom a year past, claimed by the same unforgiving land, and then little Annie, just a babe herself, taken by a cough that winter. The silence stretched, filled only by Lily's faint, whimpering breath and the ever-present sigh of the wind. Then, Sarah lowered the rifle, resting its stock on the porch. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a profound, shared understanding of loss. "Bring her," she said, her voice surprisingly soft, yet firm. Elias dismounted, his legs stiff and uncooperative. He stumbled slightly as he carried Lily towards the porch, each step an agony of hope and fear. Sarah met him at the steps, her gaze fixed on the child. Without a word, she reached for Lily. Elias hesitated for a breath, a primal reluctance to release his only remaining link to Martha, then surrendered the child into Sarah's outstretched arms. Sarah cradled Lily with an instinctive tenderness that made Elias's throat tighten. She looked down at the tiny, drawn face, then met Elias's desperate eyes. There's only one way," she said softly, a faint flush rising on her sun-weathered cheeks. She turned slightly, unbuttoning the high neck of her simple dress. Elias looked away, a wave of profound gratitude and an equally profound sense of his own inadequacy washing over him. He heard the soft rustle of fabric, a small, contented sigh from Lily. When he dared to look back, Sarah was seated on the porch rocker, Lily nestled against her breast, suckling with a surprising strength. A tear traced a path through the dust on Elias's cheek, unnoticed, unheeded. The sight was sacred, a Madonna in a wasteland, and he, a beggar at the gates of mercy. Sarah didn't speak, her gaze soft on the child, a shadow of her own lost motherhood in her eyes. The wind still whispered its mournful song, but for the first time in weeks, Elias felt a pinprick of something other than despair. It wasn't hope, not yet, but a fragile respite, a moment of unearned grace in a world that had offered him none. When Lily was sated, sleeping soundly, Sarah gently readjusted her dress. "You can use the barn," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Till she's stronger." "There's a cot." Elias could only nod, his voice lost somewhere in the vastness of his relief. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the cruel landscape in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, and for the first time, Elias didn't see it as an ending, but as a pause. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the child. Elias, true to his word, worked. He was a man accustomed to hardship, his body lean and corded with the kind of strength forged in relentless toil. He repaired the sagging section of Sarah's corral fence, his movements economical, his focus absolute. He cleared stones from a patch of ground she hoped to plant come spring, the rhythmic thud of his pickaxe a steady beat against the silence of the prairie. He spoke little, offered no information about his past, and asked for nothing beyond what was given. Sarah watched him, her initial wariness slowly giving way to a grudging acknowledgement of his capability. He was a phantom, really, a man who had appeared out of the dust with a dying child and a past he wore like a shroud. She saw the pain in his eyes when he looked at Lily, a raw, unguarded grief that mirrored her own losses, though his were fresh, as dulled by the relentless passage of seasons. She'd catch him sometimes, standing by the barn door, staring out at the vast emptiness as if searching for something he knew he'd never find. He ate the sparse meals she provided, cornbread, beans, occasionally a piece of salted pork, with a quiet intensity, his gaze often distant. Lily, under Sarah's care, began to thrive. The pinched, translucent look left her face, replaced by a healthier, though still delicate, bloom. Sarah would sit on the porch in the evenings, Lily cradled in her arms, humming old lullabies her own mother had sung. Elias would often be grooming dust nearby, or mending tack, his presence a silent counterpoint to the soft melody. He never intruded on these moments, yet his awareness of them was palpable, a shared, unspoken tenderness for the child that bound them in an uneasy truce with their respective sorrows. The homestead, which had felt so empty since Tom and Annie were gone, now held a different kind of quiet, one punctuated by the soft gurgles of a baby and the steady presence of a haunted man. One afternoon, as Sarah was hanging out laundry, two riders appeared on the horizon, moving with an assurance that spoke of familiarity with the territory, and an arrogance that set her teeth on edge. Blackwood's men. Jed and Pike. They'd been by before, after Tom died, their offers to buy the land becoming less like offers and more like veiled threats with each visit. Sarah's hand instinctively went to the rifle propped against the cabin wall. Elias, who had been splitting wood near the barn, stopped his work, the axe resting by his side, his body seemingly relaxed but every line of him alert. He didn't look towards the riders, but Sarah knew he'd seen them, heard them long before she did. Jed, a burly man with a perpetually sneering lip, reined in his horse, kicking up dust that settled on Sarah's clean laundry. Pike, younger, with shifty eyes, grinned unpleasantly. "Afternoon, widow," Jed said, his voice carrying an oily confidence. "Just checking on our favorite neighbor." Sarah's chin lifted. "I ain't your neighbor, Jed." And I'm fine, land still for sale, I reckon, Pike chimed in, his gaze lingering on Sarah in a way that made her skin crawl. Mr. Blackwood still interested. Generous offer, considering it's not for sale, Sarah said, her voice even, though her heart hammered against her ribs. This was Tom's land, Annie's. She'd die before she let Blackwood have it. Jed's eyes flicked towards the barn, towards Elias, who stood motionless, watching. Got yourself some help, I see, Jed observed, a new note in his voice, a hint of challenge. Elias met his gaze then, his own eyes flat, unreadable. He said nothing. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. He's just passing her through, Sarah said quickly, a protective instinct flaring. Jed's gaze returned to her, a slow, contemptuous smile spreading across his face. Lots of folks passing through these days. Some don't make it far. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her worn boots. Mr. Blackwood likes things tidy. He'll be by himself soon enough to discuss matters. You think on that offer, widow? Real hard. With a final, lingering look at Elias, Jed and Pike wheeled their horses and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and unease in their wake. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Elias. His expression hadn't changed, but she saw something in the set of his jaw, a hardening around his eyes, that hadn't been there before. He picked up the axe and resumed splitting wood, the blows falling with a controlled, rhythmic force. The piece, fragile as it was, had been shattered. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain and the faint, unmistakable odor of trouble. The trouble wasn't long in coming. A few days after Jed and Pike's visit, Sarah found a section of her south fence cut, the wire snipped clean, her small herd of cattle scattered out onto the open range. It took her and Elias the better part of a day under the searing sun to round them up, their patience worn thin by the heat and the blatant malice of the act. Elias said little, his face a grim mask as he expertly mended the fence, his hands sure and strong on the wire stretchers. The next morning, the water in their well was fouled, tasting of kerosene and something else, something bitter and unwholesome. Lily cried with thirst until Sarah managed to strain enough rainwater from the barrel for her, her own throat parched. Elias took dust and rode out, returning hours later with 2 full canteens, his expression unreadable as he explained he'd found a small, hidden spring miles to the north. He didn't say if he'd seen anyone, or any sign of who was responsible, but a new tension coiled in him, a watchfulness that reminded Sarah of a wolf scenting danger. They worked side by side, clearing the well, a back-breaking, disheartening task. The shared labor forged a silent bond, a camaraderie born of necessity and a dawning, mutual respect. One night, a scream tore through the thin walls of the barn. Sarah, startled from a light, uneasy sleep, rushed out, her rifle in hand. She found Elias thrashing on his cot, his face contorted, muttering broken phrases. "Martha, no, the fire, run!" He cried out again, a sound of pure agony that chilled Sarah to the bone. She hesitated, then gently touched his shoulder. Elias he bolted upright, his eyes wide and unseeing for a moment, wild with a terror that was stark and raw. Then, recognition flickered. He stared at her, breathing hard, sweat plastering his dark hair to his forehead. The fight drained out of him, leaving him slumped, vulnerable. "Just a dream," he muttered, his voice hoarse, turning his face away. But Sarah had seen it, the profound torment that lay beneath his stoic surface. She didn't press, just nodded slowly. "The wind's picking up," she said softly, an excuse for her presence. "Sounds like a storm," he didn't reply, just sat there, staring into the darkness of the barn, a solitary figure wrestling with ghosts she could only guess at. The next day, as if the land itself sensed their vulnerability, Blackwood himself arrived. He rode a fine black stallion, its coat gleaming, a stark contrast to the dust-caked horses of his men who flanked him. Caleb Blackwood was a man who carried his power like a tailored coat, handsome in a predatory way, with eyes that missed nothing and a smile that never quite reached them. He dismounted with an air of proprietorship, his gaze sweeping over the small homestead, lingering on the mended fence, the freshly turned earth near the well. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice smooth, cultured, but with an underlying steel. I trust Jed and Pike conveyed my interest in your property. Sarah stood on her porch, Lily asleep in a sling against her chest. Elias was nearby, ostensibly checking a harness, but his stillness was absolute. I heard them, Sarah replied, her voice steady. And my answer's the same. This place isn't for sale. The Blackwood's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Everything's for sale, madam, for the right price. This land, it's stubborn. Hard. Better suited for larger concerns. My concerns. His eyes flicked to Elias. And you must be the new hand. Strong back, I see. Elias met his gaze, a silent, level stare that held no deference. Just helping out, Elias said, his voice quiet, flat. Blackwood chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Loyalty is commendable, in its place. But misplaced loyalty, that can be costly. He took a step closer to the porch. This valley is changing, Mrs. Miller. Progress. You can't stand in the way of progress. It's like a river, it'll find its way, one way or another. Sometimes, it washes away obstacles. The threat was unmistakable, wrapped in polite language but potent as venom. He looked at Lily, then back at Sarah. A child needs stability. Security. This is a hard life you're choosing for her. The words were a deliberate barb, aimed at Sarah's deepest vulnerability. Before Sarah could retort, Elias spoke, his voice still quiet but carrying a new weight. She's not alone. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, focusing fully on Elias now. Is that so? And who might you be, to offer such assurances? Just a man who doesn't like bullies, Elias said, his hand resting near the heavy Colt holstered on his hip, a gesture so natural it was almost unseen. A muscle twitched in Blackwood's jaw. The air crackled with unspoken violence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Blackwood let out a slow breath, his charming facade reasserting itself, though his eyes remained cold. Think carefully, Mrs. Miller. My offer is generous. It won't remain so indefinitely. He turned, mounted his stallion with fluid grace, and with a curt nod to his men, rode away, leaving behind a silence more oppressive than any sound. Sarah felt a tremor run through her. She looked at Elias, whose gaze was still fixed on the retreating riders. He wasn't just a drifter anymore. He was a shield. And Blackwood knew it. That night, Elias didn't sleep in the barn. He laid his bedroll on the porch, near the door, his rifle beside him. The unspoken had become spoken, a line had been drawn in the dust. The encounter with Blackwood hung heavy in the air, a promise of violence yet to come. The man's departure had left an oily residue of menace, clinging to the homestead like the ever-present dust. Elias and Sarah moved through the following days with a heightened awareness, a tension that hummed just beneath the surface of their chores. They spoke little of Blackwood's visit, but it was there, in the way Elias's gaze constantly scanned the horizon, in the way Sarah kept Lily closer, her movements more guarded. One afternoon, Elias suggested a ride into Crucible, the nearest town, a straggling collection of false-fronted buildings clinging precariously to the edge of the vast, indifferent plain. Need supplies, he'd said, his tone flat, but Sarah understood. He wanted to gauge the town, see who, if anyone, might stand against Blackwood, or at least not actively aid him. Crucible was a good 2-hour ride, and the journey itself felt like a foray into hostile territory. The town, when they reached it, was as grim as its name suggested. Dust lay thick on the boardwalks, and the few faces they saw were closed, eyes quickly averted. The saloon seemed to be the only thriving business, emitting sounds of tinny piano music and rough laughter that felt obscene in the otherwise funereal quiet. Elias left Sarah and Lily, who was nestled in her sling, outside the general store, telling Sarah to wait while he went to see the sheriff. The sheriff's office was a small, dilapidated building, its sign faded and askew. Elias found Sheriff Brody hunched over a desk littered with paperwork, a weary, defeated man with eyes that had seen too much and done too little. Brody listened to Elias's terse account of Blackwood's threats with a tired sigh. Blackwood, he said, rubbing his temples, owns the bank, holds the mortgage on half the businesses in this town, and has more men on his payroll than I have deputies. He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. What do you expect me to do, mister? Ride out there and arrest him for wanting to buy land? He's threatening her, Elias stated, his voice low and dangerous. Intimidation. Destruction of property, Brody shook his head. Words. And who's to say it was his men cut her fence or fouled her well? This is hard country. Things happen. He looked at Elias, a flicker of something like pity, or perhaps recognition, in his eyes. My advice? Tell the widow to take Blackwood's offer. It's the smart play. He always gets what he wants, one way or another. Elias stared at the sheriff for a long moment, disgust coiling in his gut. This was the law. Broken, bought, or simply beaten down. He turned without another word and walked out, the sheriff's sigh following him like a bad smell. He found Sarah looking pale, her arm protectively around Lily. Two of Blackwood's men, not Jed or Pike, but cut from the same rough cloth, had been loitering nearby, their leering gazes making her skin crawl. They'd said nothing, just watched, their presence a silent, thuggish reminder of Blackwood's reach. Elias's eyes narrowed, and the men, sensing the shift in his demeanor, the cold promise in his stare, ambled away with forced nonchalance. Let's get what we need and go, Elias said, his voice tight. They bought flour, salt, coffee, and a few precious rounds of ammunition, the storekeeper serving them with a nervous haste, his eyes darting towards the street. As they were mounting up to leave, an old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, pressed a small, misshapen apple into Sarah's hand. For the child, she whispered, her eyes fearful but kind, before scurrying away. It was a small gesture, but in the oppressive atmosphere of Crucible, it felt like a tiny spark of defiance. The ride back to the homestead was silent, the weight of their isolation pressing down on them. The town offered no sanctuary, the law no protection. They were on their own. That evening, as the sun bled crimson across the western sky, casting long, mournful shadows, Elias took out his Colt, checking its action, cleaning the barrel with meticulous care. Sarah watched him, Lily asleep on a blanket nearby. The ordinary domesticity of the scene was a stark contrast to the grim purpose in Elias's movements. He won't stop, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded, sliding a cartridge into a chamber. No, he looked at her then, his gaze direct, unwavering. I've run from men like him before. From things I've done. Thought if I ran far enough, I could leave it behind. He paused, the confession costing him. Martha, my wife, she believed I could be better. Died believing it. The raw pain in his voice was a glimpse into the abyss of his past. This place, he continued, his gaze sweeping over the small cabin, the struggling patch of garden, the vast, empty land that stretched to the horizon, it's not much. But it's honest. You're honest. He looked at Lily, a profound tenderness softening his harsh features. She deserves a chance to grow up somewhere clean. Sarah's eyes welled, but she didn't look away. She saw the scars on his soul, the burden he carried. You don't have to do this, Elias. It's not your fight. He holstered the Colt, the metallic click loud in the twilight. Maybe it is, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Maybe this is where I stop running. He picked up her rifle, the one Tom had used. Let me show you a few things. How to make every shot count for the next hour. As darkness gathered, he patiently guided her, correcting her stance, her grip, the way she sighted down the barrel. There was a grim intimacy in the instruction, a shared understanding of the stakes. The wind whispered around the cabin, a mournful dirge, but inside, two people and a child were preparing to make a stand, not just for a piece of land, but for the right to exist, free from the shadow of tyranny. The motif of his past was clear. He was once a weapon, now he chose to be a shield. The ultimatum arrived with the dawn, delivered by Pike, his shifty eyes filled with a cruel anticipation. He reined in his horse well away from the cabin, shouting his message across the dew-dampened ground. Blackwood's patience has run out, widow. You got till sundown tomorrow to be gone. Take what you can carry. After that, this place, and anything left in it, is forfeit. He spat on the ground. He means it. Best you listen. Then he wheeled his horse and galloped away, leaving the threat hanging in the morning air like a shroud. Sarah watched him go, her face pale but resolute. Lily, sensing the tension, began to fuss in her arms. Elias, who had been chopping firewood, slowly lowered his axe. The time for waiting was over. The day passed in a blur of grim preparation. They boarded up the smaller windows, leaving only narrow slits for visibility and firing. Elias reinforced the cabin door with heavy planks scavenged from the dilapidated shed. Sarah cooked what provisions they had, making jerky, packing water. Every action was deliberate, imbued with a terrible finality. The sky mirrored their mood, a heavy, bruised grey that promised a storm. The air grew thick, oppressive, the wind moaning like a restless spirit through the eaves of the cabin. As dusk began to settle, casting long, distorted shadows, Elias finally spoke of the things he'd kept locked away. They sat on the porch, Lily sleeping fitfully in a makeshift cradle between them, the rifle and shotgun within easy reach. "My wife, Martha," he began, his voice low, gravelly, each word seemingly pulled from a deep, painful well. "She was a good woman. Saw things in me I didn't see myself. We were on a small spread, trying to make a go of it, up in the Montana Territory." He paused, staring out at the darkening landscape. "Before her, I rode with a rough outfit. Hired guns, mostly. We did things that followed a man. Range disputes, claim jumping. Sometimes it was just intimidation. Sometimes his voice trailed off, the unspoken hanging heavy between them. Blackwood is the same kind. Thinks power gives him the right to take whatever he wants. Men like that, they only understand one language." He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that was painful to witness. "When Martha got sick, the fever. I'd made enemies. Men I'd crossed. They came when I was away, looking for me. They said they were just going to scare her, make her tell them where I was. But there was a fire." His voice broke, just for a moment, then hardened again. "I found her, found the cabin burned. They said she died of the fever, but I always wondered if it was them. If my past finally caught up and took the only good thing I ever had." He closed his eyes, the muscle in his jaw working. "I ran. With Lily. Ran from them, ran from myself." Sarah reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. His skin was cold. "That man, Elias," she said softly, her voice firm despite the tremor in it. "The man you were, is not the man sitting here now. The man here saved my child. He stood by me when no one else would. He's given me hope." Her gaze was unwavering, filled with a fierce, protective loyalty that mirrored his own. "Whatever happened back then, it's past. This is now. And you're not alone in this fight." Elias looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not judgment, but acceptance. A profound, unburdening acceptance that eased a fraction of the weight he'd carried for so long. He nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of her words, of her strength. The first fat raindrops began to fall, splattering against the dusty porch, each one a prelude to the coming deluge. The wind howled, clawing at the small cabin as if trying to tear it from its foundations. Inside, the flickering lamplight cast dancing shadows, transforming familiar objects into grotesque shapes. Elias checked his Colt for the 10th time, its cold steel a familiar comfort in his hand. Sarah rocked Lily's cradle, her lips moving in a silent prayer. The storm outside was a physical manifestation of the turmoil within and the violence that was fast approaching. There was a grim sort of peace in the cabin, the peace of a decision made, of a stand taken. They were not asking for trouble, but it had found them, and they would meet it head-on. The home they were defending was more than wood and stone. It was a fragile sanctuary built on shared grief, unexpected kindness, and the fierce, primal instinct to protect what was precious. And as the lightning split the sky, illuminating the stark, unforgiving land, Elias knew he was finally done running. He had found something worth fighting for, something worth dying for, here in this desolate place, with this resilient woman and the innocent child who represented a future he hadn't dared to imagine. The attack came not with the fury of a cavalry charge, but with the insidious creep of shadows under the cover of the raging storm. Figures, barely discernible through the sheeting rain and flashes of lightning, moved towards the outbuildings first. A flickering orange glow suddenly bloomed against the side of the barn. Fire. Blackwood's preferred signature. "They're here," Elias stated, his voice calm, devoid of inflection, as he peered through a narrow slit in the boarded window. Sarah, already at her post by another window, rifle resting on the sill, nodded grimly. Lily, startled by a clap of thunder that shook the cabin to its foundations, began to cry. Sarah soothed her with a low hum, her movements economical, her focus unwavering. The first shot came from Elias, a deafening roar within the confines of the small room, followed by a yelp of pain from outside. He didn't waste motion, didn't waste lead. Each action was precise, honed by a past he now wielded as a shield. Sarah fired next, the kick of the rifle jarring her shoulder, but her aim was true, forcing a shadowy figure to dive for cover. The rain lashed down, turning the ground outside into a slick quagmire, the wind snatching at the flames engulfing the barn, whipping them into a frenzy. Smoke, acrid and biting, began to seep into the cabin. Elias moved between a window and the door, firing methodically, forcing Blackwood's men to keep their distance. They were outnumbered, he knew, but the storm and the darkness were reluctant allies, sowing confusion among the attackers. A bullet splintered the wood near Sarah's head, showering her with debris. She flinched but held her position, reloading with steady hands. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but overlaying it was a fierce determination. This was her land, her home, her child's future. She would not yield. One of Blackwood's men, bolder or more foolish than the rest, made a dash for the cabin porch. Elias met him at the door, not with a bullet, but with the raw, brutal efficiency of close-quarters combat. The struggle was short, savage, ending with the man slumping to the ground, a dark stain spreading on his shirt. Elias himself took a glancing blow to the arm, a searing pain that he ignored. He could hear Blackwood shouting orders outside, his voice tight with frustration, barely audible above the storm's roar. "Burn them out! Smoke them like rats!" The attackers redoubled their efforts, trying to get close enough to set the cabin alight. Flaming arrows arced through the rain-swept darkness, thudding against the log walls, some finding purchase on the roof. Small fires began to smolder, quickly doused by the relentless downpour, but the threat was constant. Hours seemed to pass in a blur of gunfire, smoke, and the cacophony of the storm. Elias and Sarah fought back-to-back, a desperate, valiant defense against a tide of malice. Then, through a lull in the wind, Elias heard it, Blackwood's voice, closer now, near the smoldering ruins of the barn. "Miller! Enough of this. Send the woman and child out. I'll deal with personally." Elias exchanged a look with Sarah. This was it. He moved to the door, peering out. Blackwood stood partially illuminated by the dying flames of the barn, his fine clothes soaked and mud-splattered, his handsome face contorted with rage. Two of his remaining men flanked him. "Just you and me, Blackwood," Elias called out, his voice carrying over the diminishing storm. "Let them go." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You're in no position to bargain, drifter," but Elias saw the flicker of calculation in his eyes. Blackwood was losing men, the fight was dragging on, and the storm had not been the ally he'd hoped. Elias stepped out onto the porch, his Colt steady in his hand, his wounded arm throbbing but ignored. Last chance, Blackwood raised his own pistol. The world seemed to shrink to the space between the two men. Lightning flashed one last time, illuminating the scene in stark, ghostly relief. Two shots rang out, almost simultaneously. Blackwood staggered, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before crumpling to the muddy ground. One of his men cried out and fled into the darkness. The other dropped his gun, raising his hands in surrender. Silence descended, profound and absolute, broken only by the drip of water from the eaves and Lily's soft whimpers from inside the cabin. As the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the bruised and battered clouds, the storm finally exhausted itself. The air was washed clean, smelling of wet earth and lingering smoke. The homestead was a ruin, the barn a blackened skeleton, the cabin scarred and bullet-ridden, but it stood. Sarah emerged, Lily clutched tightly in her arms, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and relief. She looked at Elias, who leaned heavily against a porch post, his face pale, his left arm slick with blood. He offered her a weak, tired smile. "It's over," he said, his voice raspy. She rushed to his side, her gaze falling on his wounded arm. "Elias, you're hurt," he waved away her concern. "Just a scratch," but the way he slumped against the post told a different story. Later, as the sun fully rose, casting a fragile golden light over the ravaged land, a few figures appeared on the horizon. Townsfolk from Crucible, hesitant at first, then moving with more purpose as they saw no sign of Blackwood's men. The old woman who had given Sarah the apple was among them, along with a few other families, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and a dawning, incredulous hope. They brought water, some food, offers of help to clear the debris. Sheriff Brody was conspicuously absent. Sarah, with Elias directing her, cleaned and bandaged his arm. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part, painful but not crippling. He watched her gentle ministrations, a profound weariness settling over him, but beneath it, a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had faced his past, not by outrunning it, but by standing his ground, by protecting the innocent. He looked at Sarah, her face illuminated by the morning sun, her resilience shining through the exhaustion. He looked at Lily, now sleeping peacefully in a makeshift sling Sarah had fashioned. This was it. This was home. Sarah finished tying the bandage and met his gaze. Her eyes, the color of a clearing sky after a storm, held a deep, unspoken understanding. "The roof will need mending," she said softly, a faint smile touching her lips. "And the fences," Elias nodded, a slow smile spreading across his own face. "Reckon they will." He was no longer a drifter, no longer a ghost haunted by his past. He was a man who had found his place, his purpose, in the heart of a storm, beside a woman of unyielding strength and a child who embodied all the hope of a new dawn. The land was scarred, as were they, but it was theirs, bought with courage, and watered by a love that had taken root in the most unlikely of soils. The wind, no longer a preacher of desolation, whispered a softer song now, a song of survival, and the quiet promise of a future to be built, together.